Hey, Retcon Raider here, and welcome back to another relaxed, rambling, quarterly retrospective. Not a whole lot to talk about with Q2, really. It was another fairly slow growth period, small but notable gains, but nothing all that out of the ordinary for a lazy spring, a couple of predictable spikes. I figure we'll take a brief look back at the numbers for Q2, chatter about the general plans for Q3, and then, as has become standard, we'll round things out by chatting about a few games that have recently caught my eye. That said, let's get started, shall we? Okay, so as I literally just said, Q2 was pretty tame as far as analytics go. We had a modest spike coinciding with the first few Lost Valley episodes back in April, and then a smaller spike for the Werewolf miniseries in May. But otherwise, the numbers were pretty low to average. In part, I'd say a lot of that is just because, honestly, aside from the first week or so of Lost Valley, we just didn't really jump into anything that was all that hyped up this quarter. We're entrenched 60 episodes deep in Wrath, which can be understandably intimidating to newer viewers. It's still doing okay though, pulling in a steady 1,500 to 2,000 views per episode, which does put it well above the danger zone I tend to watch out for on weaker series. The two bonus projects I ran did bump up a bit against the danger zone. Those being the wrap-up for Strange Horticulture back in April and the more recent Werewolf Heart of the Forest series. That was in May and June. Strange Horticulture was actually pretty consistent all the way throughout, running about 800 to 900 views per episode. Anemic, but understandably so given the niche appeal of the title. Normally, I'd be a bit worried about a series that ran, on average, below 1,000 views per. But given that it was a fairly short and for fun series, I really didn't mind all that much. I mean, we were going to see it through, as long as we got past the halfway point. And, you know, I don't really regret it. It was an interesting series, and I'm glad I got to highlight the game. Not to mention, of course, we had some good times with Hellebore. The numbers on the Werewolf series were a lot more all over the place. The series high was the first episode, as is usually the case, clocking in at about 3,500 views, and the series low was the finale, which limped across the finish line at just over 500 views. The unusual part is the resurgence the series saw in episodes 4 and 5, which is somewhat unusual, with 5 actually clocking in as the second most successful episode at roughly 1,800 views. It's interesting studying the analytics from one episode to the next on that series, because it shows that the actual positive engagement, likes, comments, overall watch time, they remained pretty consistent throughout the entire series. The main thing that tended to vary between the episodes was the number of impulse clicks that each one got, and episode 5 got a lot of impulse clicks. That actually makes sense, given that it's basic human psychology for the eye to be drawn to weird faces, especially weird faces that are looking at you. And the face in that thumbnail was moderately weird. It is actually why you tend to see a lot of YouTube creators slapping weird, goofy faces onto thumbnails. Either their own or caricatures based on themselves or characters in whatever it is they're talking about or playing. Of course, given that I am but a mere disembodied voice with no artistic talents to speak of, it's not something I can really take advantage of myself on any sort of regular basis. That aside, well, it was interesting to see that sort of surge of impulse clicks on a random Werewolf episode. It didn't actually equate to much in the way of better numbers, aside from views. Most curiosity clicks don't really turn into any real positive engagement, because people who impulse click on random videos are apt to click back off of them just as quickly. In comparison, the numbers on Celeste: Lost Valley have been a lot more predictable. The series started strong in April and has seen a slow but steady decline as we've gotten deeper into the series. That's a pretty standard pattern, with interest dropping off as people get their fill of the new series, or their interest is piqued enough for them to go out and buy the game themselves. we're about 20 episodes deep at this point, with episodes still pulling an average of roughly 1,000 to 1,500 views per. I do suspect we'll be dipping down towards the sub-1,000 danger zone as we get out towards the end of the series, but at this point, we're probably only looking at about 8 or 10 more episodes anyway. Given that the series is still placing in the top 5 on the monthly polls, there's no reason for us to not just see it through to the end. I figure we'll be wrapping it up around the end of July, maybe early August. I can't say that with any certainty, though, because we have officially eclipsed any of the game content that I saw back when I was testing the game prior to first starting to record it. I will say, though, that while I have enjoyed the return to Solasta, it does feel a lot jankier this time out. The dungeons are fine, the tactical battles are fine, the new monsters and class options are great. But I think the narrative and story stuff all just feels too rushed. The conversations tend to be rapid-fire and disjointed without any of the really amusing banter or tangents that we often saw back in Crown of the Magister. And NPCs often say things that are at odds with what actually ends up happening. Lore items, usually one of my favorite parts of games like this, are just literal sentence fragments in many cases that barely give me enough information to really theory craft or draw connections from. That's not to say it's bad, it's just, I think, a little weaker overall than the original Crown of the Magister campaign was. The original campaign was janky, but it was also charming and simultaneously provided a pretty solid tactical turn-based RPG experience. Lost Valley is janky without the same level of charm, I think. But it does still provide a pretty similar overall tactical RPG experience. In fact, in terms of overall balance and difficulty, I'd say that Lost Valley provides a more consistent challenge. We were just breezing through late-game battles in Crown of the Magister, while we've had some notably tough ones in Lost Valley. So, maybe it does all balance out in the long run. Either way, the numbers are still looking pretty decent, and I am happy I played the game. Or am playing the game, we're not done yet. But we should be wrapping it up in another 3, maybe 4 weeks. As for what we'll be jumping into after that, we've got a couple of options. The last few polls have pretty consistently pointed towards another season of Wildermyth, which I am absolutely down for, as well as the mostly standalone Pathfinder Through the Ashes DLC. I'd say those are both pretty solid options, and between the two I'll probably do Wildermyth first, because it's been too long since the last time we got to do a series with Raider inserts. Also, I love Wildermyth, and the Enduring War campaign should only take like 10 episodes. So it makes for a great palate cleanser between some of the more involved or grimdark projects. Through the Ashes is likely to also be on the relatively short side. Estimates would probably put it somewhere in the 12 to 15 episode range. And that's, again, mostly guesswork on my part. I've deliberately avoided playing it thus far because I want to go into it blind when we do the series. Between those two prospective projects, plus the wrap-up for Lost Valley, we're probably looking at a combined total of about 35 or so videos, which, alongside the main Wrath series, which we'll continue alternating with, will probably see us through the rest of Q3. I'm not entirely sure what we'll get into after that, but I know we're looking at least a few potentially interesting projects once we get out towards Q4. Just off the top of my head, we've got Marvel's Midnight Suns launching in October. We've got the Rogue Trader Alpha sometime in Q4. Not to mention, I believe Scarlet Hollow Chapter 4 is supposed to drop sometime in October or November. We're pretty much guaranteed to take a quick detour for that one. For the rest of it, I suppose we'll really just have to wait and see how the next few interest polls go. Plus, there's always the chance that we might end up getting blindsided by some big new release. Which, I suppose is as good an excuse as any to jump into the Retcon Radar segment of the video. 1 second. There we go. Okay, as has become the new standard, I pulled a small assortment of titles for my watch lists, just to chatter about a few of the upcoming games that have recently caught my eye. Mind you, we're not really going in depth on anything here. Not yet, anyway, though I'm obviously leaving the door open for potential one-shots, minis, or even full-blown series if one or more of these games really ends up resonating with the Raiders. This is really just to give you a better idea of what I'm looking at, what sort of projects I'm considering, and to just shine a spotlight on some interesting projects that you might otherwise not have heard of. I'll include links in a pinned comment down below. Alright, so first up, we've got Archaelund by 4 Dimension Games, a studio which has apparently put out a couple of RPGs in the past, which I am completely unfamiliar with, but this one did really catch my eye. At a glance, it looks to be a pretty promising blend of elements from various retro fantasy CRPGs, perhaps most notably the old classic SSI Gold Box games, because it uses a first-person exploration system blended with a third-person turn-based tactical combat system. The story on this one seems pretty straightforward, at least at a glance. The game takes place in a fantasy world which, as seems to be increasingly common these days, fell into ruin due to some dread, mysterious magical cataclysm. But now, generations later, the kingdoms that survived that original disaster are making a joint effort to explore and recolonize the previously lost regions, with Archaelund being one of them. And this, of course, is where the player comes in. The game will feature its own custom rule system, which will allow the player to mix and match various careers, races, and talents to create their party of custom adventurers. Each adventurer will start as something mundane, a bandit, a beggar, or something similar. But over time, as they gain levels and unlock additional talents, they will gain access to much more powerful advanced careers such as assassin or battle mage. Humans are available as baseline race options, but other more exotic options are also available, including things like goblins, minotaurs, and some sort of snake people. I mean, look, if you give me the option to be a snake person, I'm gonna be a snake person. The player is tasked with using these systems to build a party of 5 heroic and/or opportunistic explorers, who are then set loose on the handcrafted open world of Archaelund. There is a main story to pursue surrounding the exploration and exploitation of the recolonized region, but the game is being designed with player agency in mind. The player can take all that in at their own pace, or they could just choose to ignore the main story entirely and pursue their own goals if that's what they want. All told, Archaelund looks to be a pretty solid entry into the realm of party-based open-world fantasy RPGs. Although the devs are making a lot of lofty promises, the promo material thus far looks pretty promising. The visual design seems nice, the rule system seems intriguingly complex, but without being completely overwhelming or obtuse. And I appreciate the stated effort to avoid the sort of hit point and number bloating that a lot of CRPGs, or just tabletop RPGs in general, tend to be overly reliant on once you get a few levels under your belt. That said, I will admit the game looks and sounds somewhat generic. Fantasy CRPGs are a dime a dozen these days. But I think what I find most appealing about this particular one is that it really does seem to draw a lot of the spirit of the original Gold Box SSI games, and I grew up on those things. Only in this case, it's got better graphics and presumably better balance and some more exotic options to play with. I find that particularly appealing. It hits a really nostalgic chord with me, and it doesn't hurt that the game looks halfway decent too, so I'm very much looking forward to seeing how that turns out when it hits release. Archaelund is currently slated to hit an early access launch by the end of the year, but it has been pushed back a couple of times. I wouldn't be surprised if that ends up happening again and the game gets pushed back into 2023, but you know what, that's fine. Hopefully it will end up being well worth the wait. Next on the list, we've got an oddball title. Cats and Other Lives from Cultic Games, the Turkish dev team that was behind Stygian Reign of the Old Ones. It's one of several games coming out this year that will allow the player to take on the role of a cat. A bit of an odd new trend, but one that I'm not really objecting to, I suppose. I mean, I do like cats. from what I've seen, Cats and Other Lives is essentially a 2D pixel art adventure game, in which the player will take on the role of a house cat named Aspen. Gameplay seems to be a mix of charming cat hijinks and story-driven detective work, as you alternate between things like investigating strange scents, chasing mice, interacting with your owners, and literally observing the ghosts of the past reenacting the strange history of the house, as well as the eldritch cult that once used it as their base of operations. You know, normal cat stuff. Throughout the game's 3 chapters, you go from simply witnessing the troubled lives of your owners, the Mason family, to investigating the root cause of their problems, and eventually trying to help them resolve them. It's an intriguing concept, with several of the core puzzles revolving around the fact that you are, in fact, a cat, not a person. So you end up using an assortment of very feline behaviors to overcome or circumvent obstacles as you try to ease the lives of your very unfortunate owners. Again, much like with Archaelund, no real word on exactly when this one's coming out, aside from sometime later this year. There is, however, a playable demo which is currently available on Steam. Next on our list, we've got a slightly more conventional offering, Heistgeist by Double Quote Studio. This one is a story-driven RPG card battler, set in a retro cyberpunk version of Central Europe. Story-wise, it seems pretty straightforward. You take on the role of Alex, a professional thief who's left holding the bag after a job gone wrong. As with many stories of that ilk, the player is tasked with both rebuilding their reputation while simultaneously trying to figure out exactly what went wrong during that fateful job. You do this by gathering an assortment of colorful and fully voiced allies, assembling a crew, and taking on increasingly difficult new jobs to gather resources, upgrade your tools, and I assume eventually embark upon some sort of quest for absolution and or vengeance. I mean, that's usually how these things go. From a gameplay standpoint, the rest of it sounds pretty straightforward. Hacking is treated as a puzzle game. More physical conflicts are resolved via conventional deck-building card battle mechanics. As aforementioned, the story will be fully voiced, and it will include choice and consequences that will allow the player to influence how the story progresses and eventually resolves. I will say that while I'm growing increasingly weary of card-based and deck-building mechanics, I do like seeing them used in creative or at least stylish ways. And from what I can tell, Heistgeist does seem to check off both of those boxes. And you know, while it's neither here nor there, I also appreciate how relentlessly purple everything is. It shows a very clear understanding of that 80s cyberpunk aesthetic. Sadly, we don't have even a hint at a release date on this one. It's currently just listed as to be determined. So I guess we'll just have to keep an eye on it. After that, we've got an even more mysterious one, Hibernaculum by Wormwood Studios. The devs behind other visually similar and very well-reviewed adventure games like Primordia and the more recent Strangeland. I can't say I've played either of them, but they do look very interesting. I may have to investigate them a bit further in my spare time. Hibernaculum, however, looks to be a retro first-person dungeon crawler set in some sort of rust-punk science fiction setting that clearly draws heavy inspiration from sci-fi films of the late 20th century. Although they've mostly just teased exploration aspects of the game thus far, the presence of attributes and weapons does seem to imply that there will be more conventional RPG aspects as well, as the player explores this tetanus-laced labyrinth. I will admit, I'm largely intrigued by this one based on the surreal, Geiger-esque aesthetic alone, but the fact that the devs' last 2 games both got very positive reviews is also certainly a good sign. I look forward to finding out more about it as Wormwood Studios continues drip-feeding teasers on social media. That said, no point in holding your breath on this one because it does look a long way off from hitting any form of launch. Based on the material currently available, it still seems to be in a fairly early stage of development. They don't even have a store page set up yet, though they do have a Patreon, for those of you who might want to follow the development a little more closely. Next up, we've got another fairly obscure one. Kriegsfront Tactics by Togue Productions? I can't say I'm terribly familiar with those developers, but apparently they're a relatively new and surprisingly prolific game dev studio in Indonesia that has several well-reviewed visual novels under their belt. Coffee Talk actually looks kind of fascinating, so that's another one I might check out once I've got some spare time to play with. Kriegsfront Tactics, though, appears to be their first real foray into a full-blown strategy game, drawing clear inspiration from games like Front Mission and possibly Battletech, but then mashing it up with an alternate history take on the 1970s South Asian conflict. The player takes on the role of a squadron commander during an amped-up, jungle-locked guerrilla war that now involves massive missile-toting robots. It's an intriguing blend of familiar concepts and gameplay elements thrown into a fairly unusual, anachronistic historical setting. The blocky, borderline primitive mech designs and the verdant jungle setting help the game stand apart from other similar titles. And while specific details of the actual gameplay are sparse right now, the bits and bobs of information they've released thus far do seem to indicate that they'll be using procedurally generated missions to help supplement a story and character-driven narrative campaign. This is actually one of two strategy games that Togue Productions is currently working on, with the other one being Veneris Tactics. That one looks to be a bit more of a conventional strategy RPG, likely inspired by games such as Ogre Tactics and Final Fantasy Tactics. It's also on my watch list, but I think between the two, Kriegsfront just ended up overshadowing it, given its somewhat more unique concept. Regardless, we don't have any sort of release dates or launch windows on either of these games just yet, but the developers have released a virtual diorama editor for Kriegsfront Tactics, and a more conventional, playable prologue for Veneris Tactics. Both are currently available over on Steam for folks who'd like to find out more. After that, we've got Miasma Chronicles, from the Bearded Ladies, the studio behind other slick but slightly simplistic strategy games like Mutant Year Zero, Road to Eden, and Corruption 2029, both of which we've touched on this channel. Miasma Chronicles seems set to follow in the same general story and gameplay theme of those other games. Once again, set in a near future but post-apocalyptic version of Earth, this time the world has fallen prey to a mysterious phenomena known only as the miasma. The player takes on the role of a survivor named Elvis, who, along with his robotic caretaker/brother, sets out to explore the American wasteland in search of answers about this mysterious miasma. Much like in MYZ and Corruption 2029, the gameplay will be a blend of real-time stealth and turn-based tactical combat, with a heavy focus on gorgeous and atmospheric environments to explore, and a colorful cast of fully voiced characters to encounter. I personally enjoyed both of the studio's previous games, though they did both end up feeling a little too easy once you figured out how they worked, and neither really seemed to get a very satisfying ending. They just kind of stopped on cliffhangers. That said, Miasma Chronicles looks to be a visually stunning game, and I'm sure I'll enjoy playing that one as well. Hopefully the narrative is a little tighter this time around, and the gameplay is a bit more consistently challenging. But that's just based on my personal preferences and opinions. Once again, no solid release date for this one, aside from that they're hoping to hit launch sometime in 2023. I think there's a pretty good chance we'll be revisiting this one in the future, given that the previous two games both made for some pretty fun videos. Next up, we've got a title with a bit more clout behind it. Pentiment by Obsidian Entertainment. This one is also being spearheaded by Josh Sawyer, which immediately grabs my attention. He's the dev who led development on titles like Icewind Dale, Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, and that cancelled Van Buren game that I occasionally chatter about. That said, Pentiment does look to be a pretty weird game. It thrusts the player into the role of a fledgling artist who's taken it upon himself to investigate a series of mysterious murders in 16th century Bavaria. Throughout the 25-year investigation, the player will have to gather clues and interact with an ever-expanding cast of quirky characters, while also making consequential decisions that will shape both their own character as well as the world around them, altering the course of subsequent events and ultimately deciding how their story will end. Perhaps most intriguing, early teasers seem to indicate the game will never really confirm who the mysterious killer is. Rather, the player will ultimately have to use the clues they've gathered to single out the NPC they feel was most responsible for the murders, or perhaps just the one they feel most deserves to be punished by an assortment of other horrific crimes that are apt to be uncovered throughout the investigation. It's a fascinating concept for a game, made even more unique by the art style, which draws direct inspiration from period-appropriate historical manuscripts. The only real downside here is that, as curious as I am about this game, it also does sound like it's going to involve a lot of controversial and unsettling themes. Things that might not really play well on YouTube these days. The launch is slated for November of this year, so just a few months out, and I'm very curious to see what the final game is like, especially since it sounds like it's being made with heavy replayability in mind. After that, we've got a slightly more conventional series, relatively speaking. Revolution the Spark by Darts Games. What looks to be a brand new studio that's also working on a couple of other unrelated projects simultaneously. I feel like that might be a bit ambitious for a brand new studio, but I suppose we'll see how that goes. Regardless, Revolution the Spark looks to be a fairly slick entry into the turn-based tactical RPG market. Set in what looks to be an anachronistic steampunk version of the 19th century, it thrusts the player into the role of a military veteran whose brother has just been kidnapped. This, of course, ends up drawing the player into a world of conspiracy and intrigue, as their investigation runs afoul of the cruel Empress and her iron-fisted allies. The player will have to decide how to approach various obstacles, resorting to diplomacy, trickery, or outright violence in their quest to find their brother and, maybe topple a dictatorial regime in the process. While the game is a turn-based tactical RPG at heart, it does promise some degree of replayability, with 25 potential companions and 5 planned main endings, all with some degree of mutual exclusivity built into them. I do worry that this might be a little too ambitious for a first-time dev team, especially one that seems to be splitting focus over multiple unrelated projects. But I'm hoping for the best. I'm just a big fan of these sorts of anachronistic settings, and this one does have a pretty strong Arcanum vibe to it. As with many of the other games we've chatted about today, there's no solid release date on this one, just that they're hoping to hit launch by the end of this year. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most notable entry in this quarter's Retcon Radar. Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader by Owlcat Games. Yep, that's right, Owlcat, the folks behind those obscure Pathfinder games that I sometimes like to play. Right off the bat, I'll say that I tend to be very leery when it comes to video game adaptations of Games Workshop properties. While there are a few decent ones, a lot of them end up being very hit or miss, with the most recent and devastating one being Necromunda Underhive Wars. That said, having a studio like Owlcat heading up this project does go a long way towards regaining my trust. I've obviously had some pretty good experiences with Owlcat, and while I was really kind of hoping to see more Pathfinder from them, it's still exciting to see them making the jump over to other big-name licensed properties. Rogue Trader is being billed as the first full-scale retro ISO CRPG set in the Warhammer 40k universe. And given my experience with Wrath and Kingmaker, I fully expect it to be a fun and engaging CRPG experience. Enough so that I went ahead and plopped down the cash for early access. I will say that my grasp of the Warhammer 40k setting is slightly outdated. I haven't really looked at it since the 3rd edition rule set, back when they first introduced Dark Eldar and Tau. I think that's really the last time I had access to a regulation-sized ping-pong table large enough for those sorts of full-scale tabletop war games. Also, I now own several cats who would absolutely destroy the miniatures. Regardless, I am very, very much looking forward to reacquainting myself with the modern version of the setting. Apparently, Rogue Trader will essentially take the player on a scenic tour of the 40k universe, as they captain their very own void ship, looking to expand and/or exploit the borders of the known Imperium. They'll face off against things like Chaos Cultists and Tyranids, possibly an Orc or two, alongside a cast of contentious and colorful companions, such as an arrogant Eldar Ranger, a proud Sister of Battle, an alluring, unsanctioned Psyker, and of course the obligatory Space Wolf. Gotta have one of those. Now, Rogue Trader's full launch is a ways off, set to hit release sometime late next year, but we will be seeing alpha access as early as Q4 of this year, and then beta access in the first half of next year. I'm not sure if we'll be touching on it quite that early, but it is a definite possibility. It's ultimately going to come down to whether or not it gains sufficient traction in the monthly interest polls, so I guess we'll see. The big risk with jumping into these story-driven narrative CRPGs, of course, is that the more time we spend with them in early access, the harder it is to justify revisiting them once they do hit full launch, so we'll have to find a good balance between exploring early access content and prepping for a potential full-length post-launch campaign. And with that, I have officially exhausted my list. I mean, there are a couple dozen other oddball titles we could probably chatter about. There always are. But I think most of those are far off enough that we can probably leave them for the Q3 or Q4 retro. Plus, Rogue Trader is a pretty tough act to follow. Oh, and you know what? Given that we are just past the 30-minute mark, yeah, we should probably start winding this thing down. So, as always, I'd like to wrap things up with a thorough round of thanks, both to the raiders and the rank-and-file viewers. I know I've said it before, but I really wouldn't be able to keep doing this if it wasn't for fine folks like you. I mean, I probably would still dabble in making the occasional video as a hobby or something, but that would make them much more sporadic, few and far between. As it currently stands, even just putting out 15 or 16 videos a month is basically already a full-time job since this is essentially a one-man show. But I will say, being an amateur content creator has given me a lot more respect for the folks who do this sort of thing as a full-time professional career. It's exhausting. I mean, yeah, it's also fun and rewarding most of the time, and certainly preferable to going back to my old career as a full-time customer service drone, but it is also exhausting, especially for someone as old and increasingly introverted as I am. Which, of course, just makes me all the more thankful that there's still a slowly expanding audience of folks like you, who seem to enjoy the content I continue to crank out. It also makes me even more appreciative of the folks who take extra steps to support the channel, whether it's by commenting, subscribing, or clicking one of those other buttons that do things. They keep changing how all that works, but I'm pretty sure all the buttons are basically good now. Except for unsubscribing, so maybe, don't click on that one. I would also like to give a shout out to the raiders in particular, the extra fine folks, who take it upon themselves to help me defray the costs of running the channel, and also just, helping me and my cats remain both housed and fed. Their support is particularly invaluable these days, given that we've got all these new current events just endlessly stacking on top of the old current events that never really quite finished going away. So, interesting times. With that in mind, I'd like to give special thanks to all the honorary raiders that were active during Q2. Alexander Hawkbaum, Austin Fagan, Benjamin Gray, Bose77, C1S, Chronosaur, Dale Johnson, Ego2, Egon Alter, Ethan Vonderweed, Evan Prince, Flamebeard, Gresham, ICU Uwu, Maximilian Monk, Misha, Morgwen, Oil of Hope, Optimal 2, Peter, Rob H., Roman Berger, Scott Brown, Served Cold, Stephen Reeder, Steve Saxa, and Vertigo 322. I'd also like to give extra special thanks to the veteran raiders from Q2, Adri Raven, Anachronian, Drakith, Glenn Jensen, Indiana Smith, James Tremiere, Jace Orkblood, Jeffrey McInnes, Casvis, Lady Shayna, Laura and Mike, Leroy Nukinson, Lacknishender, Mark Giemza, Max Robespierre, Michael Bain, Nerdprof, Neurolancer, Nishko, Nod Goblin Nico, OMG, Raximus Savage, Sensei Yums, Sean Orpin, Stoltz, Terry Williams, The Link King, The Book Thief, Thomas K. Arata, and Zarmal. And I suppose I should make some token mention of the Raider Elite, the Raider Captains and Raider Lords and whatnot. You may have heard their names once or twice. I think I sporadically acknowledge their existence in the occasional video. Not really sure, I don't watch my own stuff. But yes, according to my notes here, that apparently includes notorious rogues like Matthew Smith and Revenant, as well as an assorted collection of scoundrels and ne'er-do-wells, like Aloise, A Nerd in Warpaint, Dragon Matrix 7, Eerie V23, Excelsior, Gottlieb, Kazorm, Lima, Nathan Welch Jr., Thomas Pietkowski, Trip Hoppenskip, and Valenrook. Truly a who's who of scum and villainy. Thanks for your support. So, if you, too, would like to join the ranks of the inglorious Retcon Raiders, then feel free to check out the links to my PayPal or Patreon down below. I'm also finally getting that whole YouTube membership thing going this month. Just need to work out a few kinks first, but I should be able to emulate most of the rewards that I offer over on Patreon. Of course, keep in mind this is still a small channel, and pretty much all of the revenue ends up getting folded right back into overhead, including living expenses for both the Clouder and myself, in that order. But membership in the Raiders does come with some rewards, stuff like the occasional rambling blog post, slightly more cat pictures than normal, shoutouts and special thanks like the ones I just did in this video right now, preferential placement on any waiting lists I happen to be running, and even early access to select videos, as long as you're at the Veteran Raider tier or higher. One thing that is still pending is potential designs for things like emotes and badges. I didn't really have to do those for Patreon, but it is a thing on YouTube. I've just got it set to the defaults for now, but I am kicking around a few ideas. Party hat, disco ball, assorted cats. I feel like that sort of encapsulates my distilled essence, but I am certainly open to suggestions. Anyway, I think y'all get the idea, so I won't belabor it. Regardless of whether or not you choose to join the Patreon or the new YouTube membership thing, just know that I still appreciate your support, even if it is just watching some of my videos and or clicking on the occasional button that does one of the assorted things. As I've said before, that stuff does all add up. That said, this is Retcon Raider, signing off. Oh, and special secret thanks if you actually made it this far into the video. I know not everyone does. If you need to contact me for any reason, you can reach me on Discord, Facebook, Patreon, Twitter, YouTube, or with my official email address. Links are in the description.